This is the topic 4, sorry. And we have only 2 panelists, but the same kind of approach with discussion and then some remarks or summary by, in this case, it will be Ralph Bax, which is the head of the Pediatric Medicine Office here at the EMA. So this topic is a little bit more, we as EMA and PDCO, of course, we are a bit more in a listening mode. So do not expect that we come up with yes and no's or will do, we won't do, because that is not going to happen. But we do need elements of reflections to improve our operations. And again, we have put to you 2 questions around which to focus your interventions or your reflections. And without further ado, please, Geneviève, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And yes, as my slides are prepared. The only thing I wanted to say at the beginning is I'm a bit concerned that in this presentation I'm going very, very technical. So what I'll do is I'll take maybe a minute to explain the PIP agreement process and the PIP modification process so that people realize how it's actually is done. So for industry, you start thinking about your PIP as early as your proof of concept study in a way, because you need to be ready to file your PIP at the time of, 6 months after the completion of the adult PK study, which is basically at the end of phase 1. So a PIP is not just clinical studies. It is a long way away from just being just clinical studies. It might be sometimes, most of the time you're going to have commitments in many areas. You have commitments regarding formulation, so that this is fit for the age group you are going to treat. You have commitment regarding preclinical safety to actually check that your compound does not possibly create harm in a developing child, like you would do if it affects, for example, if you do a study in younger animals. You also do some PK, PD data to actually look at the way the compound is absorbed, and only when you have that data would you actually start the actual clinical study that most of the people in this room have been talking about. The time it takes between actually agreeing or starting preparing your PIP and agreeing your PIP and actually carrying out the study for real can be any time between a year to 5, 6, maybe even longer, because of the amount of data you actually are finding, you actually have to have in hand before you do your studies. At the end of the PIP agreement, you actually have what we call key binding elements, which will describe all the studies you're doing. So you will have key binding element for your formulation, you'll have key binding element for your preclinical study, etc., and all the way to your study. If you have a PIP in place and you find that you can't do it again, then you have to modify it. And you take your key binding element and you come back to PDCO and say, I can't work on that and that, and you try to adjust them. So there are a number of processes, and those processes are actually very, very technical and actually take inside the company resources from all part of the company. So it's not just one person who's going to write a PIP. It's going to be clinician, it's going to be toxicologist, and it's going to be also people working in regulatory affairs. So that's just to set the scene, because definitively I have a very technical presentation. I just want to actually explain to people what it is. So improving PIP application, very clearly we were asked to do look at the operational challenges in the procedures and come up with practical solutions. So we have here both an idea about the challenges and very, very practical ideas about that can be addressed. Something that is very, very clear, in the 10 years since the legislation came into place, a lot of things have changed beyond just the pediatric regulation. There has been a lot of changes in the regulation. As industry, we have seen them come. And you might not be aware of them, but we've had financial penalty regulation, we have new pharmacovigilance legislation, improvement of uteracity and public data coming around. The second bullet point is the important one. There has been very big changes in the way EMA works, and I'm just singling here 2 aspects of it. The introduction of the PRIME system, where you have for unmet need and for substances that we are new, you can actually be accompanied by the EMA to help you develop optimize your development is the best way of putting it. And also there's an increased voice of patient and experts in procedures. So that's a key aspect. And there has been huge change in industry, and I can tell you that is a fact across all industry, that we now have specialist staff. We have department, we have people who actually are handling all the pediatric development to ensure that we do it in the best way. Last but not least, and you've heard it repeatedly around, there's been changes to the environment, and with the arrival of new technical solutions and scientific advances. I mean, we heard about the RAISE Act and the targeted, looking at target for pediatric oncology. If you look at technical solution, we are now talking about decentralized clinical trials where the patient is actually followed from their home instead of having to come to a center. So whatever is discussed in the PIP improvement, we need to really take all of that into account and think really outside the box and what we've learned elsewhere and bring it into pediatric. So apologies for the slide being a little bit small, but I think this is the key slide to understand what, from the industry side, we believe are the 3 priority areas to address. Sorry, I'm going to have a problem because I have to look at my own slide and my microphone is not perfect. So there are 3 main buckets. One is about scientific content, one is about the process, and the last one is about documentation. Scientific content, the key issue, the key problem is that we have detailed PIPs which are agreed very, very earlier on and then need to be repeatedly modified. So you will agree at phase 1 detailed for all your measures, being there preclinical, be them clinical studies, at the time when, in fact, you only have assumption. You do not have yet data. And you also are working with a certain standard of care and a certain competitive environment. And remember, I said between agreeing a PIP and actually carrying the studies, you can have years, literally. So that's one aspect. The other thing is attrition rate. I mean, in industry, probably 1 product out of 4 will move out of phase 1 all the way to marketing authorization. So you're actually utilizing your your resource 3 times out of 4 for something that might not progress further. And if you do continue, there is a burden then updating, modifying that PIP so that it can be running. So if you address this challenge, you will have the ability to design better studies that will allow the generation of data on the use of children in a better way. And I think that's the key thing, is making it better. So actually it's easier and it fits better with the way industry works. If I now go into my purple bucket on the PIP process, basically the PIP process do not allow enough dialogue before and during the process. I mean, all along today I've heard about let's listen to one another, let's be together and talk together. And I think this is what is not happening quite enough in PIP procedures. The possibility of dialogue before filing a PIP are relatively limited. Once in produce start, there is little or no opportunity to discuss with the PDCO and no possibility of involving other stakeholders. It's a single discussion between one company and the PDCO. We do not bring patient or carers or other stakeholders into the room. Many PIP application and PIP modification actually withdrawn because we do not get to an agreement. And sometimes because you need a PIP to file your adult indication, as time goes on and on, as a company, you accept a PIP that might not be manageable just because you need to be able to actually file for that adult indication. And also, you heard it again and again as well, pediatric development in global, and we need opportunity to actually align across regions. And I think that was clearly identified around. So addressing this challenge will help to have procedures that run better and with more predictable outcome. I mean, pharmaceutical industry is a risk-averse industry. It's very innovative, so it takes big risk on innovation, but then after that it needs to be able to continue and understand that it manages the risk within that investment. Anything which is not predictable, generally speaking, is actually very difficult to handle. And the last one, maybe the smallest one, is documentation. I mean, documents that are prepared for submission and the related procedure that goes with those documents are very complex. I mean, assembling application is quite burdensome. It's not possible to reuse information you've used elsewhere. Some areas of uncertainty remain. We still have discussion about the scope of the PIP, condition, indication, MEDRA, etc. We still don't have clarity on things like that. And the obligation, those key binding elements, are extremely detailed. And to actually showing that we've complied with them can be really quite tricky. So addressing this challenge will help to have clearer documents and decrease the general burden. So I have slides on each one of those. They're relatively detailed, so I'll stay very high level, but I'm quite happy going to the detail maybe later when we have question and answers. So regarding the scientific content, and for those detailed PIPs which are agreed too early and have to be modified repeatedly, the solution is to acknowledge that a PIP needs to be built progressively. You have stepping stones already built in. You do your pre-clean and use your pre-clean data to move into your pharmacokinetic data. Use your pharmacokinetic data and your adult data to inform your phase 3. So if you actually stagger those commitments, into the way they're going to be generated during your development process, then you have something that actually works better. It fits with the way industry works, and it allows to have each iteration of your PIP being better informed. So rather than having everything on the table and modifying it, please put a little bit at a time on the table and agree as you have the data. So if you go to the following slides, I mean, I'm not going to go into great detail, but just to give you the concept. So when you file your first PIP, you file with as much data as you have and as many measures as you can commit to at the time, but you also file with your timeline for development, with the dates at which you expect the next information to come. And then you say, I'll come back. So you will say, for example, I will do a pre-clean, a PKPD. I'm expecting to do a phase 2B and maybe a phase 3, and I expect to have the data to decide on that at this date. The first date is a commitment. So you will come for that thing and come with your data and do the second iteration. And you continue with that second iteration again. The next date is agreed, and you come back again. You might have PIPs where you do not need iteration because you have a pediatric disease which is very aligned with the adult disease. You know your endpoint, for example. You know how to do things already. But you have PIPs where really you are charting unknown water. You have never done that therapy area. You do not have endpoints. So you cannot commit at the end of phase 1 to the design of the phase 3. It's much more sensible to do the research work, to talk with other people, and come up with the best study design. The inspiration for that is PRIME, and because that PRIME system is exactly that. We have a commitment as industry to come back next for the next scientific advice, next with next data, and get again regulatory input. This is also very suitable for extrapolation, because at the moment, if we do a PIP with extrapolation, we committed at phase 1 into an extrapolation plan. But by definition, an extrapolation plan is dynamic. It's going to be adapted depending on what the data is coming on. And also, I mean, Jill was hiding on death roll. If you actually time your development timeline and your PIP timeline, you will agree on your phase 3 studies and start them immediately because you've actually put them together. So you will be doing it for the standard of care at the time of your study rather than the standard of care from 3 or 4 years before and the right competitive environment. So what we expect is that the deferral which are done waiting for adult study results should actually disappear. PIP procedure and allowing more dialogue. Here the inspiration is taken from what's happening in the EMA, in marketing authorization process in EMA, because when we actually have a marketing authorization process, we have many list of questions, many stop clocks, many opportunity for dialogues, and we think we should just bring those also to the PIP agreement process and the PIP modification process. And we heard it as well when Janina was saying about look at scientific advice for working between US and EU. Have a look at what's happening in scientific advice and orphan drug designation and see if there is a way to actually have better alignment by learning from what they've done. So for the PIP learning from other EMA, as I said, increased scientific dialogue before an MA filing, before marketing authorization filing, has been known repeatedly to allow for a much better dossier that is more likely to be approved. Bring this to the PIP process. Improve the early pediatric interaction that exists to have more stakeholders. I mean, I don't know if we need even an early pediatric interaction, or we need some of those forums that we have discussing that actually allow you to have committees, or the committee having patients, stakeholders, having carers around the table. So you actually are designing the right sort of PIPs that are. And also, if you have had scientific advice, this is just taken by PDCO, and we can actually work with this directly. In the PIP procedures, without going into great detail, at the moment we have very little opportunity for dialogue in the first PIP agreement, and very often everything is finished very quickly. In an MA procedure, actually, there is a repeated list of outstanding issues that can be brought to help really reach an agreement. We need to bring that to the PIP procedure. In the variation, when you want to change your marketing authorization, you have, again, the same sort of concept. You have the possibility of having multiple questions and answers that you can then address. And you also have something we can't have also is pre-submission meeting for requests for modification. Consider simplifying some RFM, request for modification procedures, if there are really small changes. And again, bring the learning from scientific advice orphan drug to see how we can have better regional alignment. I mean, joint application form, joint procedure templates, etc. So that's certainly something where we'd be very happy to look at. And finally, the last bucket, documentation. The documents are really very, very complex, and it'd be very helpful if we could, working together with EMAs, look at which information is really needed and reused, be it in the application form or be it in the key binding element. Look also at existing guidance. Can it be improved? Is there something missing? Is there a little bit too much? For this one, very simply, can we just have maybe a workshop and look at the key binding element and see which one are really critical? After all, there is 10 years of experience within EMA. It would be interesting to see what really a company needs to deliver on to really show that they've complied with their PIP. Collecting information, we know that the EMA collects information in databases and also look at a lot of information we give in, but can we make better use of what's been given elsewhere? Can we use investigator brochures? Can we actually make cross-reference to orphan drug designation dossier or to briefing book from scientific advice, to the MA dossier as well when the product is already marketed? Consider the concept of a CTD-like approach. For those who are not in industry, the common technical document is the single format we use worldwide to organize our data for marketing authorization. And we can give the same package of data around the world, and there is just like a regional element on top of it. Maybe we need to consider that as well and encourage alignment across region using that sort of concept. On the EMA side, it'd be really interesting to see what are the areas where they get the most queries. For us in industry, certainly it's always the scope of the PIP. Should I have more than one condition in my PIP? What is this? And then maybe it'd be worth looking at that and see there is a little delta of guidance that's needed. And then simplify the compliance check. At the moment, it's a very heavy process that can take about 6 months. And we really think that there is a way of actually looking at actually bringing the partial compliance check, reassess whether they are necessary, look at the process and identify clearly when would the PDCO needs to be involved. So conclusion from the industry side, we really think that the learning of the last 10 years are there to help us develop something better. Really looking at what we have. If we create, agree, and conduct PIPs in a way that's much more fitting with the normal development process, then we are much more likely to create better studies, avoid deferral, have more credibility in what we've actually produced. If we have better PIPs, then we can complete them. And believe me, if we complete PIPs, it's benefiting all of us. It's not industry that benefits, it's the patients at the end of it that benefit for completing PIP. That's the long and the short of that one. And if we have an earlier and better scientific dialogue, then we can have extended expert base and we can evaluate those PIP in a better way. And key, bring the patient back there, bring the patient back and the carer into this process. And that's all for me. And I definitely want to look and work on that.
Thank you, Geneviève. I think we have already a number of action points, but please, Mark, you can complete, because now it's your turn to add action point. We'll listen.
I wasn't going to add action points now. I've just got a few slides, if I may. So I have to start by apologising for two things. First of all, I'm not the best person to give this presentation, but I suggested several other people, none of whom could come. So Enpr-EMA has made some suggestions as to what could be included in this, and I want to pay tribute to the people who were kind enough to make some direct suggestions that I'm going to talk about. The second apology is that I'm not going to criticise the agency. We were told to be challenging, and I'm afraid my colleagues were not able to find it in them. That's the thing with paediatricians. We like to catch people being good, because that's often a more powerful way to develop behaviour change. But that's just paediatricians. So academics are involved in paediatric investigation plans in three ways. First of all, through publicly funded paediatric investigation plans, and one example of that has been the FP7 project mandated under Article 40 of the regulation, and we're very grateful to the Commission, and particularly to Alexandru for all the massive help they put into that. And we also contribute to other paediatric investigation plans, for example, by providing supportive evidence that is used in the design or ad hoc inclusion in PIPs, and hopefully clinicians of all sorts, nurses, pharmacists, and the occasional doctor can give advice about the development and implementation of PIPs. So I'd like to propose an action point, which is more funds under Article 40. Hopefully the Commission has heard that the difficulties that all 19 projects had were not entirely the fault of the academics. Hopefully the Commission has learnt that there were problems and issues and learning points with the paediatric investigation plans that everybody shared, and hopefully that we can all learn from. So if there is more money under Article 40, it will be even more productive. So on behalf of all the sick and dying children in Europe, I ask our colleagues in the Commission to help us lobby for more funding under Article 40, because that money will improve the health of children. So the first team made these points. Now, I'm a great believer in qualitative research, so I put up these quotes so you can read them and draw your own themes. But what is realistic is critically important. And many of the drugs we currently use have very little evidence to support their use. This is a neonatal position, and very stringent requirements will mean that this will remain the case. So day 30 feedback is very helpful. Hooray for EMA. The request that the proposed modification does add time cycle time, so that might be something to think about. Process to modify is relatively simple. However, echoing what Geneviève said, the forms can become unwieldy, and ironically, I think version control of the paperwork is a challenge, which is a problem because we spend so much time controlling versions for everything else. And one suggestion is that the change of rapporteur or other EMA staff can lead to problems. And I think from the academic point of view, we'd value a greater handover process within the agency when that becomes necessary. There are some non-neonatal people involved in this, and this is one of them. And it's vital that all team members understand this and understand what key binding elements mean. And this is an educational piece, particularly for academics, but maybe for some of the smaller first-time SMEs. Again, is this achievable? And that's where we need to work on preparedness. And here's somebody's experience where the regulators might ask for more patients than you consider clinically necessary and realistically able to recruit. I'll leave it at that. And then regulators don't appear to fully appreciate the time, cost and effort required to open new sites, which can be a huge challenge, particularly when budget and timelines are short. Public funded budget timelines are short. Commercial funding is always short and always has to be justified. Now, as Geneviève said, open dialogue is really valuable and should be maximized. So we see this as positive feedback that hopefully can be generalized. And discussions have been very helpful. And when it is possible for the coordinator from the agency side to chat with people, then that's very valuable because it avoids misunderstandings. And so hopefully that can be generalized. And again, I apologize that we are not criticizing, but very good experiences with PIP applications, but clearly that isn't general. And a native speaking English scientist was an advantage, and lots of preparation and lots of discussion. And it took one group 17 months to prepare a PIP from having the idea to getting the PIP authorized. So maybe that's a short time, but maybe it's a long time. And then modifications are seen as a positive thing as long as you discuss them and document them within simplified paperwork. Another neonatal team, where do these neonatal people come from? So this team felt there's no open communication between the agency and academic PIP leaders. Now, this may be specific to academic projects, and clearly we need to work on educating people, but I think Paolo Rossi has some plans for that. And again, somebody else is suggesting that everyone needs to be more considerate about what is possible in real life, what will be acceptable to the international community. Now, maybe we need to turn that round, and the international community needs to find ways to tell everyone what is possible in validated ways that can be trusted and are predictable for risk management and for regulatory scrutiny. What's realistic? Which studies would clinicians engage with? Again, that's a two-way challenge. We need to be better at communicating what is possible. And now coming to a neonatal specific issue, but maybe this is relevant to all legacy off-patent medicines. What is the balance between getting the really necessary missing information on drugs that have been used off-label for decades and what's possible to do in clinical trials? And if the process remains so complicated, not many neonatal drugs will make it to a PUMA. So I think this group is saying that either we make it easier to have synthesized information about off-label medicines, or we stop complaining about off-label medicines. Because if we bring all off-label medicines to the same standard as new chemical entities, then that's impossible. So there's a trade-off there that we need to make as a whole community. Now, this is a surprise. This person speaks better English than I do, as is often the way, but this person found the high formal English was to be the biggest hurdle in discussing things with the European Medicines Agency. Yeah. So the solutions are our trial preparedness, as we've started. Maybe academics need to have a different way of working with the EMA, or work with experienced consultants. We would ask for even better continuity within the EMA pediatric team, which in this day and age with continuity planning being so difficult, we accept. Version control, even more open communication, because when that does happen, it's valued highly by the teams and improves the quality of the research. And then review the extent of the totality of the evidence required for regulatory judgments about legacy medicines. And I'll repeat, please let's work towards more funding for off-patent medicines under Article 40 of the regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I knew you did not disappoint us with homework to do, but please open for discussion. Gilles.
First of all, I would like to fully support Mark's statement about no blame, no shame. This is the motto of Accelerate. And clearly this is building on evidence and solutions. So I fully support this. The point I wanted to make is the following. We describe a very complex process with a huge workload for everyone. Everyone. And I remember a dialogue with Daniel Brasseur a while ago, where he told me, Dr. Vassal, you know, the spirit of the regulation is that PIP should be approved at day 60, and exceptionally, when there is some issues, should move to day 120. Well, clearly what we saw over the last 10 years, that most of the PIPs are approved after day 120, and very few are approved at day 60. So can we have an objective together? Simplification of the process, because clearly it's not evident that this complex process assures feasibility of the PIP and so on. Can we have an objective that in the next years, most of the PIP will be approved in 6 months rather than 120? That will decrease the workload, and I postulate that it will not jeopardize the quality of the PIPs, will not jeopardize the feasibility of the PIP, but may, on the contrary, improve. It's a little bit provocative, but it's a proposal.
Thank you. There, please.
Yeah, Marek Migdal, I am the Polish PDCO member. I would like to return to the presentation of Geneviève on this issue of scientific content and the problem, as you raised, the need for the modifications. I'm not sure if all of you know the data provided by EMA to the European Commission in this 10 years report of EMA to the European Commission, and looking for the figure on the reasons for modifications. On the first place, more than 40%, it was the change of the timelines. The second was the change of the sample size, 14%. So altogether, change of the timelines and sample size were almost 60% of the reasons for modification. And it was on the request of the applicants, not on the request of the PDCO. Looking for the, as you said, the problem that at the early submission of the PIP, maybe there are no enough scientific knowledge, and there is a change during the time of the PIP of the science. But looking for this data, the change of the primary or secondary endpoint as a reason for modification were just few percent. So in majority, there's the problem of the change of the timelines. So the question is, if this unrealistic approach from the applicants, or maybe there is also a problem during the assessment by the PDCO. And the second point, linked to your presentation, you mentioned that there is a lack or not a proper dialogue between the applicant and the PDCO. I think that from our point of view, from the point of view of the members of PDCO, we are open for any kind of the dialogue. The minutes of the day 30, 60, 90 discussions are sent immediately after the plenary meetings to the applicant. So the applicant gets a chance to comment it, our discussion. We are open for any request of the teleconference during the process of the assessment, of the PIP assessment. And last but not least, quite frequently, we get also these oral hearings with the applicants, and there's a real, very often there is a real exchange of our positions. So I would like commented on these two issues. First of all, on the reasons for modifications. It's not really related to the change of science or medical knowledge, in my opinion.
So Idrun, and then Dirk wants to make a comment, and Agnieszka.
I would like to make a comment. Thank you for that comment. And I think what you described, you see the symptoms of the reason. Because in the moment we have an endpoint, for example, which was designed, or even a comparator in the product against standard of care, which was designed for 2-3 years ago, and science goes forward. Then you realize in the moment you launch your study that you don't find patients, that patients don't want to go in the study. And I think if you look to the PIH workshops, that was widely discussed. So, but on the other hand, if you try to do an ethical study, you will not, if you have maybe already a number of patients in the study, you will not change your endpoint. You will try to do everything to get that study moving. And what you in PDCO then see is a shift of timelines and the shift and the try to reduce the patient numbers to get that once agreed study to a regular end and to still get useful data out of that study. So I think you will only in very rare cases see that an applicant or a sponsor comes back to change the endpoint, because that means you have to start the study from scratch again.
Dirk and then Agnes.
Thank you. As you know, we're here to make proposals. And thanks, Jill, for being provocative on the timelines for the PIP opinion. Every time we discuss at day 30, we try to find the opinion at day 60. I can tell you from the PDCO, the problem here is that once we have given the opinion, it's the opinion, and we can't take it back or change it on our own motion. So that's why we are trying to be as definite as we can, and that takes sometimes a bit longer than 60 days. That's unfortunate. But maybe we find a solution, and that I will come back to Genevieve's presentation to build a progressive PIP. I quite like this view, also from the state of science, when you have to come first very early and you know little and you have to do all in a PIP. The only, and we have discussed this in the PDCO many times, whether we can do some sort of progressive PIP opinion. The point there is we have to implement some measures. That's the problem. And I say some measures, the key binding elements are there as measures, so to see whether you fulfill the requirements in the PIP opinion or not. But of course we can discuss other key binding elements in the first place, which then would be different in the second place and the third place whenever you come back. But here I would like maybe to challenge you, what from your point of view, to make you come back, because that's a problem we have. Yeah. So from your point of view as an applicant or industry, what would be the key binding elements you would accept to say, okay, that's as far as we can go, and if we are there, we come back. Yeah. So maybe that could be something we can elaborate, and then of course, Jill, come back to your question, we may be able to do in 60 days.
Agnes, please, and then
maybe I can add my questions at the same time, so the answer can be a general answer. I see from the 10-year report we have two main issues. One is that there are no PIPs in some areas where we haven't met pediatric needs, and the second one is the majority of PIPs are not completed. So in all the presentation, I've seen some reason of feasibility, so that maybe explain why some PIPs are not completed, but I haven't heard from industry. And that is always the case when we hear a proposal from industry. They are generally directed to regulators, health professionals, patient, family, society in general, very little to themselves to say what they are going to change to make things happen. And the other area being when we don't have any single individual PIPs in unmet needs, what is industry is going to change to make this happen? How can we ensure that the situation which has been described in the 10-year report is changing? That, I think, is missing from all the presentation. I think other stakeholders were more self-criticizing, maybe in what it's not a criticism, it's more they feel a responsibility in changing the situation. I haven't heard that much from industry.
So, Geneviève, thank you, Agnes.
For the answer to Dirk, I think it's really worth looking at what's happening in PRIME, because my limited experience from PRIME is you actually come with all your questions as well. you can actually, and you really commit for the next date. And then you commit and you will organize. And this is actually, if you want to progress a program, that's the best way. So that's that I would say. I would just say the other thing also I would like to maybe pick up from Agnes. I personally, when I see uncompleted PIP, I am absolutely unable to know from the data, are they not completed because the pediatric project has been abandoned? The adult project has been abandoned or not? Because at the moment, this is not something that is very easy to see. I mean, I can say from my company, anything PIP that is continuing and is trying to complete. So unless I have really something that tell me for the 1,100 PIPs that there is at the moment published on EMA website, how many of those are truly, really PIPs that are continuing, or are they sign of the attrition of projects which have been abandoned? And I think that would be maybe the best way. I don't know, because I mean I can look at list of projects and I don't know which one are stopped or not, because we can file something that we've stopped, but it's not mandatory. So
and no one knows, I guess. That's the issue. No one knows where all the PIPs are. I guess the European Medicine Agency don't know until you go back to them whether you did make progress, you are on checking compliance or not. So it could be that information of the ongoing plans is made publicly available just to fine-tune, and if a PIP is stopping for good reason or for any reason, it is worth knowing that. Could it be, maybe this is a question of transparency, but could it be a way just to share information from industry, from academia, about, okay, this PIP is there, going well, or no, having issues?
Which an iterative PIP will allow you, because you see the decision being actually added to rather than decision being frozen, and you do not know if it's because it's get there. I mean, that's definitely, it's not something I personally had thought about. But
I would like to the floor to our colleague from the European Commission to expand this binary dialogue.
Thank you. I would like to say a few words because there have been raised a couple of issues regarding off-patent projects, so projects on off-patent medicines, and I have been the project officer on this in this area. So it's not that simple that the Commission doesn't provide the funding. So let's start with the beginning. So after the regulation, we had during the FP7 a number of 5 calls. So it's quite a large number of calls. Usually we didn't used to have calls 1 year after another for the same area. For the off-patent, there have been out of 7 calls. In 5 of them, so in 5 years out of 7, we had dedicated calls for this Article 40 for off-patent projects. And we were happy to have funded around 20 projects on clinical trials and 1 large network group, all of them encompassing funding for about 108 million euros. Now, after the FP7, as you know, the Horizon 2020 came with a different philosophy. And this was imposed on us. It was nothing that we can do about. So it was decided that course during Horizon 2020 should be bottom-up and that we should avoid strict dedication of funding for certain areas. However, there has been 1 call on pediatrics, and we have tried to do our best to still keep open calls for pediatric funding. We kept funding a lot on the rare disease area. There have been many calls and many projects here, and many of them address pediatric needs. And also we had to learn from what has happened. So the experience with the 20 project in off-patent areas has been promising but not exceptional. And we have faced different challenges that most of them have been already mentioned here. So the major challenge that we have seen is that the excellent capacity of the academic consortia was not always met by the power of the companies, the SMEs. Because during this course they were coupled, so addressing pediatric needs, but also supporting SMEs. Unfortunately, in most of the projects, we had issues with the SMEs. So either they did not have the financial capability, or the technical capability, or there were regulatory problems like revocal of the GMP status and things like this. So many of the projects have been affected by this. And then we have realized that we need to do something to help better the pediatric area. And therefore, this call of the IMI2 has been designed such as to bring the industry in the area. And as you will see, the funding of this call is pretty big. It's a large contribution from the Commission and also an in-kind contribution from the industry. And a part of building the network and expansion of the clinical, we also have in mind the expansion of this network further, also to address the off-patent area. So the thing is that in the future, if we are to reconsider this area under Article 40, there will be, we will need your help, because the decision, the funding decision, is taken by the Parliament and the Council. So the Commission can propose, but we cannot dedicate funding to this. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for this contribution. I think we have, as I said at the beginning of this topic, we were more in a listening mode, so I would not try to even summarize what has been said, but I do see a lot of elements that we can reflect upon, and we do realize that there are areas where we can, they're within our control and our sphere of influence, and that we can actually do something about it, action plan, and others that require a broader reflection. This workshop has started the steps in that direction, but I let Ralph now summarize some of the topics that came, but to manage your expectation is not going to say yes, no, unless I'm mistaken, but I hope.
Should I surprise you? No. Yes, it was an interesting discussion and about handling of PIP, so very operational. And what then did surprise me, that of course also the preparatory part of it all will also have an impact on the actually handling of the PIP. So we mentioned here the preparation, asking for relevant expertise, having communication, early interaction with stakeholders, perhaps also outside of the PDCO, and of course the call for adequate funding, so indeed an appropriate handling of a PIP can be supported. The next main points obviously were focused on process and documents. So if I go to process, here we had one point which was interesting, is of course how best to learn from what we are doing, learn from other procedures. So we had references to scientific advice to improve our ongoing interactions. We had references to PRIME and to the marketing authorization application procedure. And obviously, scientific content and coming up again and again, in this case, of course, from a more procedural point of view, is the iterative PIP. Another point also in all what we are doing, I mean, our procedures are a way of communication, obviously. So here we can still improve communication at different levels. So apparently also adapted to the applicant. So it starts at the pediatric coordinator taking up the phone and discussing, up to then it carries on to early interaction, having a continuity in the team in the PDCO. And for this early interaction, where, as you know, we have had a pilot, also to further work on how to integrate different committees. There was a proposal, PIPs by day 60, and that I could oppose to the request for even increased communication possibilities, various various requests for modification being permitted, oral explanations, which obviously also take time. So we will not find a solution which fits all. We will have to be flexible. So in some instances, it will depend on the condition, the product, obviously, and also the applicant, and finally also the preparation. Then we heard proposals. I will not go into detail regarding PUMA requirements and also the process. Modifications, yes, needed on one hand. How can we improve handling according to the modification detail? It could be a timeline. It could be actually a complete revamp of the PIP. And finally, documents. Here it has been proposed to continue to work on simplification. It has been also acknowledged that it is, of course, resource intensive, but we should have a discussion about how are we going to go in the future with key elements. How can we, in a smart way, define and manage key elements? Yes, of course, the compliance check, version control for Part B to F, improving guidance here was also an interesting aspect of also doing it in a targeted way. So where do we have most questions and then perhaps target to improve this guidance. Others were more technical, CDD format. And I think that is quite a huge array of what can be done and where we all of us can work on.
Thank you, Ralph. I'm sure this conversation will last quite some time because we need time also to digest and dissect all the elements that we can work on within the frame of the legislation and those that may entail change of practices or change of the guidance or other tweaks in terms of interactions, collaboration that we would be more than willing at least to explore. Keeping in mind, and I'm happy that today, in the entire day, we haven't heard any discordant voice in terms of what is the ultimate purpose. So we are here not to produce PIPs, we are here to produce medicines that actually go to children. Maybe we kind of tend not to forget it. Nobody ever forgets, particularly certainly not all the pediatrician and the healthcare professional in the room, but we may be forgiven for saying that perhaps we tend not to have them as the guiding light all the time, even in the way we conduct our discussions, in the way we address our points of agreements or disagreements or proposal for improving. If we all keep in mind that we have one goal, I think every conversation becomes easier.